Hello, everyone. This is Charles Walter Buntjer coming to you from San Francisco. It's 2025. I just came back from Iceland for my birthday, and I also just did a quick cruise to Norway on the Queen Mary 2. I was thinking about some interesting stories I might tell you, and I think this one about my sister Yvonne is a great story to tell. She was born on a farm in 1932. I was born on a farm in 1940. So we grew up, of course, with many pets. We had dogs, cats, we had horses, ponies, we had a pet pig, had a pet goose. I even had a pet raccoon, of all things. Now, my sister got married in 1952 to Ken, and they moved to Rockford, Illinois, and bought a beautiful ranch house on a corner lot. And they had a son, William, which they called Bill. And you can see in this picture, there's my sister Yvonne, her husband Ken, and Bill, and their dog, Duke. And they also had a cat named Boots, but Boots decided not to be in the picture. You know how cats are. And I was in the military in 1953, 63, I should say. I was drafted and I was sent to San Francisco to work in the computer center at the Presidio, overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge and Angel Island in downtown San Francisco. Now, I'd fly back every 10 months or so for 5 or 6 days and spend a couple of days with my sister and her husband, and then I would go and visit my father and my stepmother on the farm, and then back to San Francisco. Now, when I went there the first time, I was surprised because, of all things, there was an iguana in the living room. What's going on? So, my sister told me one day she decided to take a walk around the block, and there was a woman in the house that didn't really talk to anyone. My sister was walking by, and the woman went to the window and waved at her, and she asked her to come into the house. My sister thought it was rather strange, but in she went, and then the woman said, "I hear you were raised on the farm, and you had lots of pets and know all about animals and stuff." And my sister said, "Yeah, I do know quite a bit about animals." And she said, "Would you come with me?" And they went into the basement, which my sister thought was strange. They're in the basement, and the woman says, "It's in the paper bag by the furnace." My sister thought, well, this is weird. She went over to open up the bag, and the woman stepped back toward the stairs to go upstairs. Yvonne opened the bag up and looked inside, and there was a lizard about a foot long. She thought, well, this is weird. She looked again. Is that an iguana? The woman said, it's been in there for over a month. And my sister said, well, what has it eaten or drank? Did it drink anything? No. She said, my brother, my 10-year-old son's uncle, got him this for a gift, and he doesn't want anything to do with it, neither do we. So we put it in this bag and put it down by the furnace in the basement. It's been there for a month now. And my sister said, well, you haven't fed it or anything? No, we were going to put it out in the tree, and it was freezing out in snow, and let it just die. But then we thought, well, we'll just put it in the bag and put it there and let it starve to death. Of course, that went over big with my sister, and she went and reached in and took the iguana out. He was, as I said, about a foot long, put it on her arm, put the other arm on top of it, and held it close, make sure it was warm. And she said, well, I'll take it home and see what I can do. So she put it in the bag, and off she went back home. She got home. The living room and the dining room was one long room. There was windows in the north end where the living room was, and a fireplace. And then the southern part of the room had two windows looking, as I said, south, with the dining room table pushed up against the windowsills. So that, she, her husband, and Bill could sit at the table, and if they had guests, they could always pull it back away from the wall and the windows. So she gets a box out and she puts some towels in and all that stuff, and she puts the iguana in there. And her husband comes home and he looks in the box and he goes, "Oh, brother." And then her son, the dog, and the cat come over and look in, and she says to him, all of you behave, because she said, "This poor lizard is sickly and needs help. So don't give him any hassle, or me." Well, they all just shook their heads and, "Oh, whatever." So the next day she takes the iguana out and puts him on the table in the dining room, and she tries to give it something to drink, and she cuts up some lettuce leaves. It goes, and she goes. So the next day she did the same thing. On the third day she goes, "I don't know what to do." So she's at the grocery store and she says, "Oh, seedless grapes, those big, fat, juicy green ones." She said, "That would be a good thing for him to eat." They, his stomach hasn't had anything in it for over a month, and his intestinal tract. So she said, "This has got pectin in it, which is sugar. It's got liquid in it." So she buys it and goes home and puts the iguana on the table, and she sits there and she goes, "Here." And she goes, "Here." So then she finally gets irritated and puts him back in the box. The next day she says, here's your grape." Well, the iguana goes, so she says, "Fine." So she crams open his mouth and puts the grape in his mouth. And he just sits there. And she says, "Fine." So she puts him in the box. And the next day she gets up and goes to check on him, and he's looking up at her with that look. And there's the grape. It's laying on the towel. "Fine." She picks him up, puts him on the table, and she says, "If you don't eat this, we're just going to let you die." So she crams his mouth open and puts the grape in it, and she goes, Now, I'm sure he had teeth, so I don't know what she was doing, but she cramped open his mouth, cranked it open, and she goes, "All right." And she pushed it way in the back of his throat. Well, he was not happy, and he goes, and it went down. He goes, so she said, "Fine." So then she took another grape and put it in his mouth, and she jammed it all the way back in his throat. And he goes, and then he goes, He sat there for a while. He went, "I have something in my stomach." So then he goes, up a little bit, and he goes, and she goes, "Pop," and he goes, "Bum." And then he comes up a little closer, and she goes, "Plop," and he goes, "Ooh," and then he gets a little closer. She said, "That's it for today." She said, "You haven't eaten in over a month," and she said, "Your intestinal tract is screwed up in your stomach, so we don't want to do too much at once. So back in the box." So the next morning, she gets up, she looks in the box, and he's there like this, ooh, and she picks him up, puts him on the dining room table, and she takes a grape, and he goes, ooh, and plump, bump, bump. Well, he was perfectly happy now. His stomach was full. He was able to do a poop eventually, and he was very happy. And he started walking around on the tabletop. Then he looked over at the window and he went, So he put his head in between the curtains and he looked around and he says, "Oh, this is really nice. There's a big windowsill here and the sun is shining from the south, and I can lie on here all day and just toast away and relax like I normally would do in the jungle." So Ivana opened the drapes up just a little bit so he could get in and out. And so every day he'd wake up in the morning and he's all hot to trot, and she'd give him his grapes, and then he started drinking a little water and doing lettuce and stuff. So she was a happy camper, and she kept calling the iguana he, and of course her husband Ken says, that means he's going to become a pet, because once you start calling somebody a he or a she or something, and then she says, well, maybe we should call him Gus. Oh, brother. Well, so Gus was the latest family pet. Now, he kept sleeping in the windowsill, and she'd put him in the box at night, and actually what happened was he started to grow, and he was a foot long, and then he was 2 feet long, and she'd sit there at the table sometimes during the day and she'd do paperwork and pay bills, notice that. And he'd come out of the window sill and walk around, and he'd crawl up her arm and get on her back of her shoulders, and his head would be here and his tail would be here, and they'd be hanging on. And then he'd watch what she was doing, and then she'd get up, she'd do chores and make the beds, do this and do that, and laundry, and whatever. And then he was all happy, and he went around the house with her and checked everything out. And then she'd go back, and he'd get off and go back in the window and just lounge around there and stuff. Was very happy. But as time went by, she started getting irritated about the whole thing about feeding him, and she wasn't sure what to do. So one day, she went into the laundry room, and there were two bowls there. The large bowl was for Duke the dog, and the small one was for Boots the cat. And she looked and she said, well, this is weird. Gus was in there sniffing around in the dog bowl, and he was licking around in there. And she said, they eat plants and stuff and fruit and things. What's he doing in there? She went, I wonder. So she put the big bowl here, the little bowl here, and a medium bowl in the middle. And then she called them all in, because every morning she fed them in the evening. So the dog and the cat came rushing in, and Gus just stood there because he's like, what's going on? So she takes the can with a spoon, goes ting, 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 ting. And then she takes Gus and brings him over and plops him down. And then she puts food in the three bowls. And she puts Gus in the middle bowl, and then she stands there and she says to Duke, the dog, she says, you love to eat your food in 2 or 3 gulps, glop, 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 and that's it. And the cat fiddles around over here. But she says, you don't fiddle around with the cat's food. Boots's food is Boots's. And now this is Gus's food in the middle. So nobody screws around with his food either. So got that? So she puts them all down, and she turns around and she's walking out of the door to the laundry room, going into the kitchen, and suddenly she gets to the door, she whips around and she says, you! And poor dog just goes like, she said, I know you were thinking about going over there and eating that food. She said, don't you even think about it. She said, you go outside. There was a door out there for him to go, a doggy door. So off he went to run around the yard and stuff, and now she didn't have to fiddle around anymore with the food for the 3 of them. She just fed them twice a day. Well, you should have seen Gus started growing like there was no tomorrow, eating dog food instead of good vegetables and stuff. I don't know. So things were going along just fine. And one day my sister was sitting in the living room reading the paper and relaxing, and Gus decided that he was going to come out and sit in the dining room table and check out what was going on. And Duke had come in from outside, and he walked past the dining room table and gave that look to Gus, and then he turned around and he started walking toward Yvonne, and Yvonne said she looked over, and suddenly Gus, why she don't know, he crouched down at the edge of the table and he went whomp, and he flew through the air about 6 feet in the air, and he landed on top of Duke's back. Duke's head here, Gus's head here, Gus's arms around, his front legs around Duke's neck, and his back feet hanging on, and Duke went and Gus went, and Yvonne had a trauma. She said, don't you dare do anything. She says, just keep calm, keep calm. She says, don't worry, I'll take care of everything. Duke, just behave, keep calm. She goes, here I am. And then she goes and takes Gus off, and she said, you, what are you doing? And she puts him back on the table, and he goes back on the windowsill, and Duke goes, he goes, and he came over, and Boots is sitting there by Yvonne, and then on the other side is Duke shaking all over, and she holds him, and she says, everything's okay, don't worry, it's not gonna happen again. So things seem to be going along just fine. And then her husband decided that something had to be done because Gus was over 2.5 feet long, and he wasn't going to fit in any box anymore or anything. And it did get a little cool at night. So Ken thought, and even though he wasn't exactly enthralled with having the iguana, he of course was a nice person. And one day he saw the neighbors and they had a refrigerator delivered with a big wooden box. And he went over and he said, "Are you going to use that box after you take the refrigerator out?" And they said, "No, no." He said, "Can I have it?" And they said, "Yeah." So he took the box home and he put it into the laundry room. And he went out the woods and he found a big long log with a branch on it. So then he put that into the wooden box and attached it to the one wall so that it was like a tree growing up with a branch out of it like this. And he put some grass in the bottom. And then he got a screen door and he put onto the front of it. So this was going to be Gus's new home. Now, what's even funnier is he wasn't too sure about having an iguana for a pet, but then he went out to the garage and he looked around and there was one of those lights that you use when you do the engines on a car. It's got a metal cover with some wires around it so that you can't get burned in case it falls on you. So he glued that to the top of the box, took the cord outside, plugged it in, and then he put a little red bulb in there that didn't really show much light, but it was a little warmth coming out of it. So that evening after everybody ate, he takes Gus over and opens the door up, and Gus looks like, "What's this?" And he goes, "There it is." So Gus isn't too sure about this. He steps inside in the grass, the dried grass and stuff, and he goes, And then he goes, "Ooh, I guess the jungle habit clicked in." He saw that trunk like, and he crawled up that trunk, and he crawled over onto the branch, and he just laid on the branch like this and under that little warm light. And Ken shut the door and locked it, but it was a screen door, so the air still could go in and out, and Gus could look out if he wanted to. And Gus was perfectly happy. Just what more could you want? You've got a mother who takes care of you. You've got a window to sit in during the day and look out at the yard and stuff. And then you've got food. And then at night you can go into your tree house and just take a nice long sleep at night and stuff. Everything's perfectly fine. One day, my sister gets a phone call from a newspaper in Chicago. I'm not sure if it was the Chicago Times or which one. And they said somebody had told them that she had a pet iguana. They wanted to do a story, and would you come to Chicago? So they actually got in the car, Ken and Yvonne, and off they went to Chicago. And they went to the newspaper, and they took photos and interviewed her. And then I think it was the Museum of I'm not sure, Natural History. And they wanted her to come over because they hadn't really seen a live iguana that had been a pet like that. So they went over there and everything. And then they had I don't know if it was a 1 or 2 page spread in the newspaper, a whole page with a picture of Yvonne with Gus around her neck and everything. So they'd also become famous now too. So another year went by, and all at once Yvonne said, "Something strange is going on." Ken said, "Well, what do you mean?" "Gus doesn't want to eat anything, and something's wrong. He's not happy, and, he doesn't want to get on my shoulders and stuff, and he doesn't want anything to do with anything. He just lays there all day and looks unhappy." "How can you tell he's unhappy?" "He's unhappy." So they looked all around and they finally found a veterinarian that knew something about reptiles. So they took him to the office and they said, "We don't know what to do." And my sister said, "Well, can you keep him overnight and tell us if you find out what's wrong with Gus?" So they left Gus there, and the next afternoon they got a phone call, and the vet said they should come in because they knew what was going on. Oh, so in they went. And the doctor or the vet said, Well, first of all, you're going to have to change Gus's name because it's not a male, it's a female. Maybe you should call her Gussie. What? What do you mean it's a her? He said, and the reason that she's unhappy is that she is full of eggs. She's got eggs that are jammed all over her body, and it's horrible, and she's in terrible pain, and we can't get her to lay the eggs, and we've done everything we can, and we don't know if we should operate, but we're afraid if we do a slit along there and then try to get them out and sew it up, because it is a reptile, and we're afraid that it's not going to work. And she's in horrible pain, and we think maybe it would be best if you put her to sleep. Oh, my poor sister, you should have seen her. She was so unhappy. But, growing up on the farm, we knew when an animal was in pain, sometimes it was better if they were put out of their misery. So she went in and sat there, and she had Gussie, come over and put her head in Ivana's arms, and she held her, and she said, everything's going to be okay, don't worry. She said, it'll all be over in a minute. And the doctor said, yeah, that's true. You just, one little pinch with the needle, and within 30 seconds or a minute the heart stops. So they did that. They gave her the shot, and then she passed away in the arms of her mother, Yvonne. And even I get kind of teary-eyed thinking about what's going on with this reptile, this iguana, who ends up dying in the arms of my sister. But I mean, can you imagine what kind of a life this iguana had? Not many iguanas have a life like that, to be saved by some woman and becoming famous and going to Chicago and being in the newspapers and all that stuff and being loved and taken care of, and one of the family. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this story. I think it's just a wonderful story, and just to show you what kind of a person my sister is, and actually the rest of my family also. So on that note, I shall drink to Gussie, and hope you really enjoyed this story, because I love telling it. Cheers.